Again, this is one of John's long gospels that we get in year A of selectionary. So I will read this story of the raising of Lazarus, chapter 11 of John's gospel. Read it just once, so you got to listen carefully the first time through. Now, a man was ill, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who had anointed the Lord with perfumed oil and dried his feet with her hair. It was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So the sisters sent word to him, Master, the one you love is ill. When Jesus heard this, he said, this illness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he remained for 2 days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you. You want to go back there? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? If one walks during the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks at night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. He said this and then told them, our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I am going to awaken him. So the disciples said to him, Master, if he is asleep, he will be saved. But Jesus was talking about his death, while they thought that he meant ordinary sleep. So then Jesus said to them clearly, Lazarus has died, and I am glad for you that I was not there, that you may believe. Let us go to him. So Thomas, called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go to die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, only about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary sat at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise. Martha said to him, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord. I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary secretly, saying, the teacher is here and is asking for you. As soon as she heard this, she rose quickly and went to him, for Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still where Martha had met him. So when the Jews who were with her in the house comforting her saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her, presuming that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled and said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Sir, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not the one who had opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died? So Jesus, perturbed again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay across. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, Lord, by now there will be a stench. She's been dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd here, I have said this, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, tied hand and foot with burial bands. His face was wrapped in a cloth. So Jesus said to them, untie him and let him go. Now, many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen what he had done began to believe in him.
Now, this is obviously another miracle that Jesus performed. And again, it was the Pharisees didn't believe what what anybody had said or what he did, since they're non-believers. But it was obvious that Mary and Martha were already had belief in Jesus and knew that he had the ability to raise Lazarus up.
Any other comments, insights, questions on this gospel passage? What about when both Martha and Mary came to Jesus? They both said the same thing. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
I suppose they thought that he could, that Jesus could help Lazarus before and heal him so that he would not die. Because, and then I suppose they were hurt and, angry because he wasn't there.
But do you find it interesting that they said the exact same thing?
Yeah, they did. One did not hear the other, right? From what I see here.
And that's the way the passage reads, no. Okay, well, let's move into the lesson for tonight. And a little bit of change in participants. Linda, who's normally on in the morning session, had an appointment this morning, so she's joining us tonight. And Kathy Wiley, who's usually on in the evening session, had something going tonight, so she joined the morning one. So be a little bit of a different mix in participants this week. All right, this lesson starts with pilgrimage to the temple. And on page 50 and top page 51, it talks about some of the ideas of what a pilgrimage is. A pilgrimage is traditionally understood as a journey made to a specific destination solely for a religious purpose. Because a pilgrimage was most often undertaken on foot and required anything from days to weeks or even months to complete. a pilgrimage demanded complete dedication. And the purpose of a pilgrimage is to arrive at a more profound relationship with God. So what do you make of those three statements?
When we went to the Holy Land on that tour, was that a pilgrimage?
Well, was that a religious site? Was it for a religious purpose?
I
Yes.
think so.
Yeah, that's exactly what a pilgrimage would be.
Well, that was so great to see the places that we read about so many times. We actually got to see them.
Yeah, when you are there and you're reading from the Bible, something that happened and you're standing on the spot where it happened, it's quite a moving experience.
Right.
I wouldn't say life-changing experience, but it's certainly an experience with some pretty great significance. What about the rest of you? Have any of you ever been on what you would call a pilgrimage?
Mm,
Visit to a shrine someplace, even here, someplace in the United States or close by?
Nope, I didn't.
This morning, I think all the participants this morning had talked about a grotto that's in Iowa, and I remember going there as a kid. They were wondering if that was a pilgrimage. Was it a vacation or a pilgrimage? And I said, well, what'd you do when you were there? Well, we went to this grotto and prayed the rosary. And well, was that a religious experience? Yeah, well, then that fits the definition of a pilgrimage here. And I don't remember exactly where in Iowa it is, because I don't know how old I was when we went there. But
I don't remember the location, but it's not far into Iowa. I remember that.
Is it at West Bend? West Bend, Iowa?
Could be.
'Cause I remember my parents talking about it. They had been there.
This would have been probably mid-50s, late 50s when we were there. Well, the pilgrimage that it's addressing here is that there are certain feasts that someone should try to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, for the celebration of those feasts. So that would be a pilgrimage. It's just like on Holy Week, where we have what's referred to as the Chrism Mass, generally held in the cathedral for each diocese. And people are encouraged to attend that, where all the oils to be used and sacraments for the coming year are blessed and distributed to the parishes. So even something like that could be a pilgrimage. You're going to this special celebration to experience something that only happens once a year, but has an effect for multiple sacraments that we would be celebrating in the parish. So the oils that are used in baptism, oil of catechumens and the chrism, and the oil of the sick that's used for anointing of the sick. But as it starts talking here about pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the temple, it then gets into the kingdom being divided. Now, last week we talked about the exile and entrance. So the entrance into the promised land is Joshua led the Hebrew people across the Jordan into the promised land, and Each of the 12 tribes eventually settled in a different area in that land. Each had their territory that their tribe settled in. And the people were being ruled by judges, people who would help settle disputes and guide the people. But they started asking for a king because the surrounding countries all had kings. And God finally gave in and had Samuel anoint Saul as their first king. And then, as we heard in the first reading last Sunday, God was not pleased with what Saul was doing, so he sent him to Bethlehem to Jesse to anoint one of Jesse's sons, which turned out to be David. So David was originally ruling over what was known as the Northern Kingdom, so the 10 tribes that were in the north. And then eventually he was able to bring in the kingdom. So that we had the 12 tribes all united under one king. Both the northern 10 and the southern 2 tribes were all united together, and David ruling from Jerusalem. And then his son Solomon followed David and tried to hold the 2 kingdoms together, the north and the south, but put some heavy burdens on them, so the people were kind of getting disgruntled. And then after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam took over as king and said to the northern part of the kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, well, my father was tough on you, I'm going to be even tougher and tax you even higher, which led to a civil war, and the kingdoms were again divided. So the northern 10 kingdoms, commonly known as Israel, and the southern kingdoms around Jerusalem, known as Judah. So here on page 52, we start hearing about the exiles. So the first one was, as we hear in the middle of that first column on page 52, in 721 BC, the Assyrians utterly destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, scattering most of its people throughout its empire and repopulating the land with other conquered peoples. So here we have the northern kingdom being spread out, sent off to other lands, and other people coming in and occupying their territory. And then it talks about this invasion by the Assyrians as being punishment for the people turning away from what God had called them to. As we heard in Deuteronomy a number of different times, Moses would be talking to the people who were about to enter the promised land, and that God is giving you this land. He led your ancestors out of slavery in Egypt, and God will be here with you as long as you keep his statutes and his commandments and worship God and not false gods. So that was what they were asked to follow. But here we've got some passages that tell us they weren't doing that. They were turning to worshiping idols. They were not keeping the commandments. They were not living as God wanted them to live. So that's one of the reasons it's given for the Assyrians coming in and taking over the northern kingdom. So let's look at those passages. So we go to 1 Kings chapter 12. And we're going to look at part of chapter 12, which is kind of the beginning of the story. And then we're going to jump to chapter 13 to get to the end of the story. So we'll skip some of those details in between. So 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 26 to 31.
Sorry, Randy, could you say that one more time? First Kings, what is it?
First Kings chapter 12, verses 26 to 31.
26.
26 to 31.
He said to himself, as things are now, if my people go to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices to the Lord in the temple there, they will transfer their allegiance to King Rehoboam of Judah and will kill me. After thinking it over, he made 2 bull calves of gold and said to his people, you have been going long enough to Jerusalem to worship. People of Israel, here are your gods who brought you out of Egypt. He placed one of the gold bulls in Bethel and the other in Dan. And so the people sinned, going to worship in Bethel and in Dan. Jeroboam also built places of worship on hilltops, and he chose priests from families who were not of the tribe of Levi.
So here we've got creating these gold idols, telling the people, these are your gods, and go to Dan or to Bethel, and that's where you worship. You don't need to go to the temple anymore in Jerusalem. And he's afraid if they went back to Jerusalem that they would get reunited with the southern kingdom and kill him. And then the priests were always to come from the tribe of Levi. And he's appointing these people, priests that are not Levites. So he's leading them exactly against what Moses had told the people they needed to follow. And then the next section there kind of describes what had happened during that time. And then we go to the end of the story, which is the end of chapter 13. So verses 33 and 34 of chapter 13.
Even after this, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but again made priests for the high places from among the common people. Whoever desired it was instilled as a priest of the high places. This is the account of the sin of the house of Jeroboam, for which it was to be cut off and destroyed from the face of the earth.
Okay, so being told that, hey, Jeroboam was turning you away from God, giving you these false idols, creating people to lead you in your worship of these gods that were not Levites, were not the ones chosen to be the priests. So you're going to be destroyed, your altars are going to be destroyed, and your people will be scattered. So that's what led to the invasion of the Assyrians. And then we hear a little bit more about that in 2 Kings, and this is chapter 17, verses 13 to 23.
Chapter 17.
Yeah, 17, chapter 17, verses 13 to 23.
And though the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and seer, give up your evil ways and keep my commandments and statutes in accordance with the entire law which I enjoined on your on your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants, the prophets. They did not listen, but were as stiff-necked as their fathers, who had not believed in the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes, the covenant which he had made with their fathers, and the warnings which he had given them. The vanity they pursued, they themselves became. They followed the surrounding nations, whom the Lord had commanded them not to imitate. They disregarded all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 molten calves. They also made a sacred pole and worshiped all the host of heaven and served Baal. They immolated their sons and daughters by fire, practiced fortune telling and divination, and sold themselves into evil doing in the Lord's sight, provoking him. Said 17, was it?
No, 23.
23, sorry. Even wrote it down. Till in his great anger against Israel, the Lord put them away out of his sight. Only the tribe of Judah was left. Even the people of Judah, however, did not keep the commandments of the Lord, their God, but followed the rites practiced by Israel. So the Lord rejected the whole race of Israel. He afflicted them and delivered them over to plunderers, finally casting them out from before him. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. He drove the Israelites away from the Lord, causing them to commit a great sin. The Israelites imitated Jeroboam in all the sins he committed, nor would they desist from them. Finally, the Lord put Israel away out of his sight, as he had foretold them through all his servants, the prophets. And Israel went into exile from their native soil to Syria, and exile lasting to the present.
So there we have kind of the scattering of the people of the northern kingdom. Here this warning is given to both the northern and southern kingdom. But in 721, it was the Assyrians who basically drove the people from the northern kingdom out of their territory, brought in foreigners that began to habitate it. And then 200 years later, we get the Babylonians coming in and doing likewise to the southern kingdom, burning the temple and everything in Jerusalem, and taking the priests, the artisans, the skilled workers off to Babylon, and just leaving behind the unskilled people. So what we see in scripture is the prophets telling people, you need to return to God, you need to return to the commandments, you need to return to the covenant that God gave you, that he would be with you, provided you stay with him. And if you don't do that, you're going to suffer some consequences. And that appears to be what happened. They weren't listening, and first of all, the northern ones driven off to Assyria, and then 200 years later, the southern ones carried off to Babylon. But there's an interesting comment over in the middle of that second column on page 53. Historians note that the land on which these two kingdoms were established provided the most convenient route for the mighty warring powers that lay both to the north and to the south. Only when these far superior powers were at their weakest were Israel or Judah ever able to enjoy security within their borders. So this is kind of saying that it wasn't necessarily God punishing these people. It was if kingdoms to the north or the south or both were strong, traveling through this area where the northern and southern kingdoms were, was the most convenient way to get around. So they were conquering these people just so that they had control of that land. So a little bit different than what we hear in scripture as to why it was happening. It certainly could be a combination of the two. When God wanted to punish the people for turning from him, he would strengthen those neighboring warring countries of Assyria and Philistines and Babylon and other ones around them, strengthen them so that they could come in and do exactly what happened. Carry the people off to exile, destroy their cities. So what do you think of that comment there about the convenient route that it offered powers to the north or the south?
Well, taking them out of their environment, away from their temple, destroyed their relationship with God. I think, did it?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, did it destroy the relationship, or was the relationship destroyed first?
Well, hard to reestablish that relationship if you are in a different location. But
Mhm.
yes, I guess it was kind of destroyed prior to their being defeated, and maybe they were defeated because they had no strength, or God allowed that.
Was this area kind of a neutral area?
Not necessarily neutral, because
They still had to fight.
remember the story of David and Bathsheba?
Yeah, yeah, okay.
So
think
what was going on there that Bathsheba's husband was not around when David saw her beauty and took her for himself? Where was Uriah, her husband?
Ooh, I'm not sure, but wasn't he off fighting?
Yeah. So that passage begins when there was spring and kings normally go off to battle. David sent his troops off warring against the Philistines. So there's constant battles going on throughout the Old Testament. So the land of the Hebrews was not a neutral territory. Like, we look at Switzerland kind of as a neutral country that doesn't get involved in wars with other countries, where the Hebrew people were constantly battling their neighbors, and sometimes with success and sometimes with failure. So those passages we looked at in 1st and 2nd Kings were referring to the Assyrians taking over the northern kingdom. But let's look at the story for the southern kingdom. And we get a bit of that in what's referred to as First Isaiah, the first 30 chapters of Isaiah that were written by the original prophet Isaiah prior to the Babylonian exile. But we get more from the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was going around telling the people, you're turning from God. You're not worshiping as you should worship. You're going to the temple, but under false pretense. You're not really going there for the intention that the temple is meant for worship. You need to come back to God, start following the commandments, start treating people with justice, or there'll be consequences. And there were other false prophets going around telling the people, nope, everything's just fine. You don't need to change anything. People started listening to the false prophets because they liked what they were hearing from them, didn't like what they were hearing from Jeremiah, so they actually tried to kill Jeremiah and threw him into a cistern, hoping that he would just die in there. It's that idea, if you don't like the message, kill the messenger. So let's look at what Jeremiah is telling the people in chapter 7 of Jeremiah, verses 1 to 15.
What was the chapter again?
Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 1 to 15.
Got it. Okay.
The Lord sent me to the gate of the temple where the people of Judah went to worship. He told me to stand there and announce what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, had to say to them. Change the way you are living and the things you are doing, and I will let you go on living here. Stop believing those deceitful words. We are safe. This is the Lord's temple. This is the Lord's temple. This is the Lord's temple. Change the way you are living and stop doing the things you are doing. Be fair in your treatment of one another. Stop taking advantage of aliens, orphans, and widows. Stop killing innocent people in this land. Stop worshiping other gods, for that will destroy you. If you change, I will let you go on living here in the land which I gave your ancestors as a permanent possession. Is that all?
Through 15.
2:15.
Yeah, through verse 15.
Look, you put your trust in deceitful words. You steal, murder, commit adultery, tell lies under oath, offer sacrifices to Baal, and worship gods that you had not known before. You do these things I hate, and then you do these things I hate, and then you come and stand in my presence in my own temple and say, we are safe. Do you think that my temple is a hiding place for robbers? I have seen what you are doing. Go to Shiloh, the first place where I chose to be worshipped, and see what I did to it because of the sins of my people Israel. You have committed all these sins, and even though I spoke to you over and over again, you refused to listen. You would not answer when I called you. And so what I did to Shiloh, I will do to this temple of mine in which you trust. Here in this place that I gave your ancestors and you will do the same things that I did to Shiloh. I will do the same things that I did to Shiloh. I will drive you out of my sight as I drove out your relatives, the people of Israel. I, the Lord, have spoken.
So if you were one of the Hebrew people and you're hearing what Jeremiah is saying in this passage, how would you react? What are you hearing?
I would be afraid.
If you were really set in your ways and you liked how things were going for you, does this sound kind of threatening?
It does, but I might be resentful and defiant.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the people did. They didn't like what they were hearing from Jeremiah. There were other prophets at the time saying just the opposite. No, everything's fine. Just keep doing what you're doing. God's with you. And those are the ones that they listened to. And as Jeremiah warned here, will cast you out of my sight, drive you out. And that's exactly what happened. The Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem and carried off all of the people that they thought that they could benefit from, those that had the skills, the craftsmen, and the leaders. So we've got the northern kingdom being scattered in Assyria, and the southern kingdom now with a lot of the people being carried off to Babylon. So they're out of their homeland. They're taken into a land with a different culture, different gods, different way of doing things. And they're not the only ones that had that experience. The commentary there on page 54 talks about some other examples of people that have been exiled, taken out of the land that was their home, forced to go to other places, forced to give up their culture, their language. One of the good examples of that here in our own country is what happened to the Native Americans as the Europeans, immigrants began to start their westward movement. American Indians who were here first, very set in their culture and their lands for the most part, moving around. They would go to the hunting grounds during the hunting season and then to the other areas where the land might be more fertile to raise their crops. And then the European immigrants started pushing them out of their land. Eventually, the government moving them off onto reservations. So how do you look at that treatment of the Native Americans as compared to what we're reading about with the Syrians in the northern kingdom and the Babylonians in the southern kingdom?
It seems pretty comparable to me. And I think we have not mostly acknowledged that for a long time. But I think that that's very true.
What are some of the things that ended up happening to the Native Americans as far as how they were treated, how they were forced to try to change their ways? What are some examples of what happened? Mm.
No, they fought back.
And they ended up,
Indians fought. Yeah,
But
go ahead.
they lost a lot of their culture. They lost their own spiritualism to a lot of Catholic and I suppose other religious beliefs, forced into schools, children forced away from families and indoctrinated with what those people who thought they were probably doing the right thing, but really took their culture, their language away from them by forcing them to not speak their language, to not be able to worship spiritually the way they were used to worshiping, with children anyway, and I guess thought about as not as human as the people who were coming into their lands. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, Linda, you were gonna add something?
Yeah, then, hold on. Yeah, because, you know, no matter how hard they tried to settle in any place, it was taken away from them, and eventually they rebelled by attacking war parties, sending war parties out.
Yeah, the example that Sue talked about there, those boarding schools, it was unfortunately, the church ended up running a lot of those. And they were not allowed to speak their language. They were not allowed to dress in their native dress, follow their native rituals. It was Americanizing the only true Native Americans. So those that were here first established the culture. It was those that came into the country that were saying, well, if you want to be real Americans, you got to do what we're telling you to do and live our way, not your way, even though you're the ones that are native to this land. And we have a very similar example going on now in Ukraine, where first of all, people were driven out of their cities because of Russian rockets hitting schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, civilian targets. So people were leaving their cities, and as that became more widespread, even leaving the country, and you got the Russians taking young children off and taking them to Russia, just like what happened here to the Native American children taken off to these boarding schools to try to indoctrinate them and following the ways that other people felt that needed to live. And now the Russians trying to do the same thing with these Ukrainian children, bringing them into Russia and Russianizing them, I guess would be the term we could use. What do you think of that?
Sounds like very similar now. Past and the present are almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening all over again. I mean, you know, not really the current immigration, but that's what people are doing to the immigrants, more from the past, you know, trying to turn them into Americans and take everything away from them. But that is starting to come back now, more so. But I think there's a lot of similarity there.
Do any of you have this Little Rock Catholic Study Bible?
No.
Mm-mm.
No.
Okay, because there's a passage in here, commentary that kind of does a very nice job of describing what this Babylonian exile really was and what was going on. So none of you have it, I'll have to read it. And here's what it says. What happened in the Babylonian exile? What were its consequences? In 597 BC, the Babylonians took the religious, political, and economic leaders of Judah to Babylon. 10 years later, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar returned and destroyed Jerusalem, killed the king's sons, blinded the king, and took him off to exile along with a large portion of the population. Some people were left behind, those no one thought important. These were the consequences. First, the people not carried away were left with land that had been stripped and buildings that had been burned. They tried to worship at the ruins of the temple, but this was problematic since the priests had been taken off to Babylon. They lived in caves for a while and suffered dire poverty. Second, the people taken to Babylon lived together in communities, were allowed to own land and their own businesses, were allowed to worship together, and were generally much better off than those left behind. Third, the deportees, however, faced the worst spiritual crisis in the Old Testament times. They had lost the promised land. They had lost the temple, and so had no possibility of offering official worship. They had no king, and so the promise to David was in question. Had God abandoned them? And fourth, the priests, who were now unemployed since they could not minister in the temple, gathered and edited important writings such as the prophetic preaching, the collection of laws, and the people's history. They thus produced the first edition of sacred scripture, the law and the prophets. They also made religious practice portable, that is, not tied to the temple or to the land. Circumcision, Torah, and dietary laws became the important signs of their identity. The synagogue, lay leadership, may have arisen at this period. So that's kind of a nice summary of what was really happening during this time and how the people were affected by it. Either those that were left behind in Judea and those that were carried off to Babylon. So they had this long period of exile in Babylon. And then as the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, King Cyrus issued a decree that they could return to their homeland. And the commentary quotes the beginning of Ezra as the story as to how Cyrus issued that decree. And commentary also talks about that appearing at the end of second book of Chronicles. Ezra happens to follow the second book of Chronicles. The second book of Chronicles ends with the exact same passage, word for word, that we hear again immediately in the beginning of Ezra. So in both of those places, it says, Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So he coming in and giving the people their freedom, and it's saying that this is fulfilling what Jeremiah had foretold. So let's look and see what was it that Jeremiah had foretold and what was it that Cyrus, king of Persia, was fulfilling. So let's go to Jeremiah chapter 25 and verses 4 to 14.
Should I read?
Go ahead.
Okay. You would not listen or pay attention, or even though the Lord has continued to send you his servants, the prophets. They told you to turn from your wicked way of life and from the evil things you are doing, so that you could go on living in the land the Lord gave you and your ancestors as a permanent possession. They told you not to worship and serve other gods, and not to make the Lord angry by worshiping the idols you had made. If you had obeyed the Lord, then he would not have punished you. But the Lord himself says that you refused to listen to him. Instead, you made him angry with your idols and have brought his punishment on yourselves. Is that as far? I'm not sure. I can't remember how far you said.
Verse 14.
Okay. So then, because you would not listen to him, the Lord Almighty says, I am going to send for all the peoples from the north and for my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia. I am going to bring them to fight against Judah and its inhabitants and against all the neighboring nations. I am going to destroy this nation and its neighbors and leave them in ruins forever, a terrible and shocking sight. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will silence their shouts of joy and gladness and the happy sounds of wedding feasts. They will have no oil for lamps, and there will be no more grain. This whole land will be left in ruins and will be a shocking sight. And the neighboring nations will serve the king of Babylonia for 70 years. After that, I will punish Babylonia and its king for their sin. I will destroy that country and leave it in ruins forever. I will punish Babylonia with all the disasters that I threatened to bring on the nations when I spoke through Jeremiah. All the disasters recorded in this book. I will pay the Babylonians back for what they have done, and many nations and great kings will make slaves of them.
So here we have Jeremiah saying that you're not listening to God. So Babylonians are going to carry you off for 70 years. But then the Babylonians are going to be defeated and you'll be able to return to your land. So exactly what King Cyrus is referring to is what Jeremiah had foretold here in chapter 25 of the book of Jeremiah. So how does that strike you, that Babylonians were to defeat Judah, the southern kingdom, carry off its leaders and its craftspeople, keep them there for 70 years, but then they would be destroyed, and because of what they did to the southern kingdom, even though it was at God's command that it happened, and now they're being punished.
I think sometimes it's hard to believe that all those terrible things can happen, that any one person could threaten or predict that all those evil things would happen, and that people might have a hard time believing it because they haven't been believing things all along. They just keep going back to what they want to do.
So Cyrus does tell them they can go back to their homeland, just as Jeremiah had foretold. But then, you know, that first column on page 57 wasn't as easy as you might think it sounded. So it says there, after 50 years, Babylon had become a very desirable home for many of the exiles. The people sent into exile were in fact the educated, the skilled artisans, and all those most likely to have talents useful to their captors. Over a few decades, many of the children and grandchildren of these people had probably become quite successful. Leaving for Jerusalem would mean abandoning a livelihood in one of the most advanced, bustling civilizations of the world for an abandoned city of ruins that would demand more muscle than brains to come back to life. So how does that passage strike you?
Well, they got so used to living the life of luxury, they didn't want to go back and have to start over in a city of ruins and build it back up and start over, in other words. They were kind of spoiled.
I would say for a lot of them, it probably wasn't highly motivating to leave what they had, just like
Mhm.
Linda said.
So did most of them stay in Babylon instead of going back to Jerusalem?
Some of them did, but I think the majority of them made their way back there. Maybe not all at once, but
Eventually they did?
and again, those that were set free by King Cyrus were not the ones that had been carried off. They were the descendants. So the ones that were carried off had died. And these were their children or grandchildren that were the ones that, so they, for the most part, most of them never knew their homeland. They'd never lived there. It's just like what we've got here where we've got people who came into this country as either young children because their parents came in or even born here after their parents came here illegally. And now it's like, we want to send them back to their native land, which is a land they don't know. They've either never lived there or only lived there as young infants, but didn't know that country, didn't know that culture. What they know is what they experience here in the United States. But now we're saying, you're not welcome here because your parents came in illegally and you need to go back to this country that you don't even know. So that's probably the way some of these descendants of the original exiles felt. It's like, yeah, we're comfortable here. We fit in. We've got a good business. We're making a good living. You want us to go back to this land we don't even know anything about? But eventually most of them did. And then we get what's talked about there in page 59. It's everything had been destroyed. And as King Cyrus said here in this passage, it's in Second Chronicles and in Ezra. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given to me, and he has also charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So we're to build this temple up again. People get back to Jerusalem and they start building up their homes, building up their businesses, but not doing anything as far as rebuilding the temple. So what we've got there in the bottom of that first column on page 59, living solely for their own immediate gain or simply for their daily sustenance has left their lives meaningless and empty. They are apparently experiencing drought. Perhaps they are close to famine. The prophet tells them that their labors have been naught because they have declined to build the temple. Reward and punishment through natural events are still seen as a direct result of God's involvement in history. But the real theological insight that is, as long as God is not given central importance in their lives are famished. So if rebuilding their homes, rebuilding businesses are more important than rebuilding the temple and relationship with God, where's their priorities?
Well, they were selfish. So, without, they were probably trying to make a living, but without God's involvement, it was very difficult. But later it says down that eventually the second temple was completed 5 years later.
Yeah, so they finally got around to doing what they were supposed to do as soon as they got back there, but again, it's telling them, where's this temple that you were supposed to build?
Wasn't this temple kind of a disappointment to them because it wasn't as big as the first one?
Yeah, so the temple that Solomon built was quite elaborate as far as it wasn't super huge, but it was big and very well ornate, very well decorated. And this was more plain, smaller. So eventually it was expanded and built on, and till it was destroyed in the year 70 with the Jewish insurrection and the Romans putting that down and destroying the temple, which has never been rebuilt.
They destroyed the second temple?
Yeah. Yeah, so all that's left there now is what's known as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. So if you go to the old city of Jerusalem, there's this wall where the two different sections, one section for the men, one section for the women. They're not allowed to worship together. And so you'll see some of the Jewish people. And it's interesting because there are different Jewish sects. Just like we've got Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, as far as the Catholic Church, and they vest different. Their rituals are different. Some of their practices are different. In Judaism, it's the same thing. So you see some of those that are the ones wearing the black coats and the black hats and the beards, and other ones with just their prayer shawl. So between the Orthodox Jews and the Reformed Jews and some of the other, I think there's 5 different sects of Judaism. So you see that and how they're worshiping and what they're doing as they go to this wall. And there's also the opportunity for non-Jews to go in and worship there. And there's crevices because it's rock that was piled up and some form of like cement to hold the rock together. But there's crevices and cracks in there, and you're encouraged to write a prayer and put it in one of those cracks, something that you're praying for. So that's all that remains of the second temple, is that Western Wall or Wailing Wall, as it's more commonly referred to. Because it's Wailing Wall because that's where they go to lament that they have lost their temple. It can't be rebuilt where it was because that's now been taken over by the Muslims, and they've got a mosque up there on a Temple Mount. And Jews aren't really supposed to go up there. So when we're there as pilgrims, we can go both to the Wailing Wall and then go up Temple Mount where the mosque is, but Jews aren't really supposed to go there because it is desecrating the holy land where the temple had been. And there was the promise of the Zionists to rebuild the temple. And that's why a lot of the evangelicals, those that are misinterpreting the book of Revelation, are supporting the Zionists because they think they're the ones that are going to fulfill this promise of rebuilding the temple. And then that's going to bring about the glory of God in the end times.
Randy, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
I finished what I was going to say there about that. So
When you said something about if a Jewish person was to go up the mount where the Muslim temple is, that would be desecration.
no,
That
the Temple Mount where the temple really was, the Jews feel that land has been desecrated with the
Oh,
Muslim mosque
they-
up there.
they feel it's been desecrated, so they would not participate in going there.
Right.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Then we get the scroll of the law there on page 60 in the middle of that second column. This moment when Ezra proclaims the law of Moses and has it interpreted for the people of Judah is so distinctive that many scholars see it as the first moment when the Israelite religion actually becomes what we know as Judaism. So we're commonly referring to these people as the Hebrew people, or being from whichever of the 12 tribes they're from, or being part of the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah, but not really referring to them as Jews. And that kind of started here with this passage of Ezra reading the scriptures to the men, the women, and the children old enough to understand basically all day long, kind of instilling them, here's what your ancestors had been told, and now you're being told the same thing. Here's the practices that you're supposed to be following. Here's how you're supposed to be living your life. Here's the commandments and statutes that you are to follow. So scholars are kind of looking at that as that's really the formation of what's became known as the Jewish faith, even though a lot of the rituals and practices had already been in place. It was what really gave them identity as Jews. And then on the next page, it talks about when the people returned to Judah, they had to be thoroughly reacquainted with their faith, their traditions, and their history as God's people. The texts arranged and compiled during the exile would greatly help in this matter, but these were all written in Hebrew, the language belonging to an earlier people. And it says, when the people were driven into Babylon, their language was Hebrew. When they came back, it was a different, though related language known as Aramaic. So you got these passages written in Hebrew, and people now don't know Hebrew. They're using Aramaic. And eventually Greek, but so they had difficulty really getting back into their religion, which is why you've got that passage there from Ezra where he's reading and informing the people. This is what it says. This is what you're to be following. This is how you're to live. what you're to do. And then the bottom of that column, but from now on, the religion of the people will become more and more centered on ethical and ritual observance of Moses' law as interpreted by scribes and applied to daily living. A lot of their rituals and their practices were kind of put in place at this time, and the scribes and the Pharisees are the ones that are saying, this is what it says, this is how you're to do things, this is when you're to do it. And you need to follow that. Then we get into, it's referred to as another exile, and that's where we get into Matthew's gospel. And he's referring to the exile of the Holy Family going off to Egypt and spending time there, and then eventually returning to Nazareth. And we talked a little bit about this last week. How Matthew is trying to show Jesus as the new Moses. So every way he can possibly equate Jesus to Moses. So Moses leading the Hebrew people out of slavery from the Egyptians, and Jesus coming out of Egypt as a young child to free people from the slavery of sin by his passion and death. But a couple interesting comments there. First one, that last full paragraph on column 1 on page 62, referring to Herod. He is one of only a few biblical characters from the New Testament whose place in history is so well documented that there is no problem of fixing precise dates to his life. He reigned from 37 to 4 BC, which is one of the reasons historians are fairly certain that our calendars are off by at least 6 years, or from 4 to 6 years. So when we look at our calendar, we're in the year 2023. We look at the year 0, that's when Jesus was born. But if Jesus was born during the rule of King Herod, and we know for certainty that King Herod died in the year 4 BC, Jesus had to be born prior to that. So most scholars now figure it's probably the year of 6 BC that Jesus was actually born. So if we look at that he died at the age of 33, which again, we don't know that with any certainty, but we traditionally had set that as the year 33 when Jesus died. Well, most likely it was sometime in the late 20s. When he actually died, he was crucified. And then it talks about, only in Matthew do we find the account of the Holy Family's flight to Egypt. And nowhere outside of this account do we have any record of Herod slaying the infant boys in the region of Bethlehem. So that's what we talked about last week, is that slaughtering of the holy innocents only appears in Matthew's gospel, nowhere else, anywhere in scripture, nowhere else, anywhere in the secular history of the times, and especially the history of Herod, which again, that first is how well documented the story of Herod is. So, did that event really happen? Did the Holy Family really go to Egypt? Or was that a story that Matthew came up with to give more credibility to his Jesus as the new Moses? We don't really know. Doesn't really make a lot of difference whether Jesus went to Egypt or not. But the important thing is what Jesus did do. And again, scripture is to give us religious truths, not necessarily historical fact, scientific fact. And any of those types of things. So there's things in there that we know definitely are historical and accurate. Other things that are very clearly that they're myth, but again, stories that to give us a religious truth, but not this is exactly what happened, when it happened, where it happened, why it happened. It's helping us in our relationship with God and knowing how God is part of our lives. And that's what scripture is really trying to tell us.
You know, Randy, as I looked at the map, you are more familiar with that area. How far is it from Bethlehem to Egypt? I mean, how realistic is it that a family could walk there?
It would be a long journey because you go basically retracing the route that Moses led the Hebrew people through. Now, it took 40 years, according to scripture, not because the journey was that long. They were living as nomadic people
Yes.
during that time. So just like the Native Americans here would travel to the hunting grounds during one part of the season and then to the areas that are more fertile for growing crops during that part of the season, and moving around to different areas. The Hebrew people were doing the same thing, living as nomads. They eventually making their way to the promised land, but not necessary that it took 40 years going a direct route. They were doing a lot of things along the way. But it would not be a short journey. It would take them several weeks to make it, if they actually did that.
Okay. I mean, like 100 miles, 500 miles. I mean, I don't have a concept of the map and whatever. And it just seems like a long way with, I don't know, with a small child in, I guess, and I know it's not important actually, whether they went or not. I'm just kind of curious because then they left Egypt and they went another very long way. And I don't know, I tried to look at my maps and I don't know if there's a scale on them at all. And
Yeah, there was one on here, and I'm just trying to estimate. It's depending on what part of Egypt they went to, it's probably at least 700 miles.
okay. Yeah, okay. That's a long way.
Yeah.
Okay. And then another long way to get from Egypt to oh, wait a second now. Oh, and back again, I guess, to Jerusalem or Nazareth or
So in Matthew's gospel, it appears that Joseph and Mary were living in Bethlehem. Luke's gospel, they were living in Nazareth and went to Bethlehem because of the census that was being ordered. But in Matthew's gospel, they were living in Bethlehem, but when they heard that Herod's son was still doing some cruel things, they decided to go to Nazareth. And Nazareth is,
I don't even know where it is.
probably just looking here.
You know, you hear these things over all these years of details like this, and the practicality or the reality of it is never in my head. I mean, I don't even know where Nazareth is on here. And I don't know if it's important. So maybe nobody else really cares. So let's not waste everybody's time.
Nazareth is probably 70, 75 miles north of Bethlehem.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, that's good.
How many miles did you say, Randy?
That what?
How many miles did you say it was?
It's probably about 75 miles north of Bethlehem.
That's quite a distance back then.
Maybe even a little bit more than that.
Especially if you're walking.
Yeah, with a baby.
Yeah. So transportation then was either walking, a little bit by horse, but mostly by donkey or chariot or elephants.
Did you say camels?
Yeah, camels also.
Did you say camels? Okay, I mean, I was only half listening, so, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. All right.
Anything in this lesson that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about, you had comments on or questions about?
Not I. Sorry I was late. I almost,
Well, I was gonna send you to the principal's office to get a tardy slip.
Mm.
Let's look at some of the questions for this week, and we're already getting close to 8:30, so maybe we'll just look at a couple of them here. Question 2, in what ways do the demands of a physical pilgrimage reflect the challenges we experience in our lifelong spiritual pilgrimage of faith?
well, I will just read you what I wrote. We
Okay.
become tired and often discouraged I'm sure that on a physical pilgrimage, you become tired and discouraged. We sometimes lose hope and struggle to behave and think positively.
Okay. Anybody else have a response to that question?
Well, it's just, any pilgrimage, even the space or the spiritual, demands dedication and, establishing a goal. And then, actually a transformation of self and, establishing a closer relationship to God.
Okay. Then question 6, the first part of that, this talks about Cyrus's decree to let the people go back to the land of Judah. And the difficulty that we talked about, that they had kind of grown comfortable where they were. A lot of them, in fact, almost all of them had never lived there. They were born in Babylon. But the second part of that question, have you ever struggled to make a decision when circumstances made it difficult to accept something good? So here the people were being offered something good to be able to return to their native land, but a difficult decision because of how comfortable they were where they were now living. So what about our own lives? Sometimes we're offered something that appears to be good, but difficulty accepting it for some other reason.
Well, about a year ago, my husband kept falling at home and I wasn't able to help him up anymore. And so a difficult decision was to, he would either need assisted living or going to a nursing home. And that was a really hard decision to make. He wasn't happy about it, but he was safer in the nursing home where somebody could care for him better than I could.
Mhm.
So that was a good thing, but it was a difficult situation and decision.
I'll bet.
Yeah, that would be a very difficult decision to have to make. We've been together for how many years and things were going well, but now because of health, there's maybe something better, but not necessarily what either one of us want, but
Right.
Well, it's anybody, like even my mother before, until she was 99, she lived at home independently, and we just had somebody, a paraprofessional or whatever, go in and help her 3 times a week. But what was good in her situation was that she knew when it was time for her to leave her house, because of her health. It was difficult, but she knew it was time. And she always let all of us kids know that I'll let you know when I'm ready to go. And in that case, it was, she wasn't, she had a mild heart attack, and the doctor made the decision, but she didn't fight it. She didn't argue with, she said, fine, all right. And so we all moved forward with the move. So
So she lived in her own home
mhm,
until she was 99.
yep.
And how long
mhm.
did she live? How long did
Uh,
she live after that?
She went, it was about the middle of May of the year, and then December 5th she passed away.
Oh, okay.
So she wasn't there very long, but long enough to get used to things. And it was a good place. They had good German food, and homemade. They made their own food. It wasn't like all out of a box or can, if you will. So she adjusted quite well. So it's times like that. Actually, I think the decision was harder for us kids than it was for her. I know it was hard for me because I couldn't go and visit like I was used to, driving up there and spending the night in the house, spending the time there with her. And whereas well, it was memory care is where because she was independent pretty well. You could only visit a few hours or whatever, and then you had to go, so that was hard. And I know eventually we all have to make changes like that, but when it's time, I guess.
Mhm.
Well, I'm sorry for the loss for both of you, and you have my sympathies.
Thank
you.
you.
yes.
Yeah, it's only been a little over a year since she passed. So
And Mary Jo, how long since your husband passed?
He has,
um,
he's,
Oh,
he's
yeah.
Oh,
been-
I'm sorry.
almost a year, and he's at
Oh,
a point where he doesn't even walk anymore. He's got weak. Right now he's in the hospital for some type of infection that they can't seem to find. So I just
mm,
tomorrow when I go see him, I'll have some news so they can tell me if he's they can treat the infection.
Which hospital is he down in?
What?
Which hospital is down in?
He's at Mercy.
Okay. Life has got some difficult decisions that sometimes have to be made. And
Mhm.
Well, I'm sorry for all the pain that it causes you and the frustration and suffering that you are experiencing. That's great sadness.
Yeah.
Uncertainty is the worst thing.
well, next week, 29th, we will have our final lesson here. Come follow me. So a little bit of the early followers of Jesus and their pilgrimage, as well as how that relates to the faith down through the ages, down to us. Kind of learn from these three pilgrimages that we have been talking about: Abraham and Sarah, Moses and the Hebrew people from exile, and the land of Israel and Judah from occupying their homeland to exile and given the opportunity to return. So any final thoughts or anything from tonight?
Well, it was definitely a period of a lot of violence, a lot of wars and bloodshed.
It was pretty constant through Old Testament times, but it still is today.
Yeah, yeah. I was just going to say it's still going on today.
I don't know why they can't get along. You know,
Well,
seems like they're always fighting.
there's always, it's like a couple that bought my mother's house. They're from Ecuador. And anyway, they don't get along with the Mexicans. I don't know the reason. I'd have to ask my brother about it because he's familiar with more of what's going on. But anyway, yeah. And you'd think that eventually,
They'd get tired of fighting.
yeah, quit fighting. Life is too short.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. So let's close with the Lord's Prayer.
Our Father, who art in heaven,
Art in heaven,
thy
hallowed
name,
be thy name. Thy kingdom come.
Kingdom come.
Will be
On
done.
earth as in heaven. Give us this day our
Day our
daily bread.
daily bread.
Give us our
Forgive us our
trespasses,
trespasses,
as we
as we
forgive
forgive those who trespass
against us.
against us.
And
And
lead
lead
us
us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.